The happiest ending to a horrifying trip. A mushroom trip report by Julia, posted to EARBUDS.org July 1st, 2020. No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. Albert Einstein. Trip background. Names throughout the story have been changed to respect their privacy. My friend Dale and I were planning on doing large doses of mushrooms together. Our friend Missy was to be our sober supervisor, to help us if we needed anything at all that night. Dale planned on taking 6 grams, and I planned on taking 3.5. More than I had ever taken before though. I am well versed in the 0.5 to 1.5 gram world, but was nervous about taking this much following a mildly disturbing trip a week prior with roughly 2 grams. I'd skipped dinner, but had a big lunch about 5 hours before the trip. I felt more confident having Missy there, as she is well experienced and a very calm presence to have around. Here's some personal background. I'm a single 24-year-old woman living a relatively happy life far away from home. I'm active, have wonderful friends, and I love my work. During college, I'd come to terms with my depression that has basically been with me my entire life. My mum died when I was 12 from breast cancer and a brain tumour. She was first diagnosed with this when I was just 6 years old, meaning about half of my life with her was just spent caregiving for her and a terminal disease. The rest of my adolescence was spent trying to fill the role of the woman of the house and channeling all of my emotions into schoolwork. Of course, it wasn't all bad, but it definitely wasn't great. Following college, I moved across the country and almost immediately rescued a dog from the shelter. I've no doubt that he was my soulmate if there ever was one. Roughly a year after adopting him, he became sick with what eventually was diagnosed as jaw cancer. I had to put him down last summer. This was a major setback in my journey trying to tackle my depression. Losing him was the hardest thing I've ever gone through. More on this later. The intention of this trip was relatively innocent. Following some personal frustrations of a budding relationship, I realised that I love torturing myself when it comes to dating. I like to go for men that I know deep down, but won't admit I'm probably too good for. I fall for them anyway too hard, then end up being crushed by them after short periods of time. I grossly overthink things and get carried away with my hopes and expectations before they are ever even communicated. Yet I never learn and always go back for more. So the question I wanted to ask the mushrooms that night was, why do I like to torture myself so much? The journey they took me on to answer this question went far deeper than I ever thought was possible. The experience. I came up fast and started to hallucinate about half an hour after eating the mushrooms. I was very happy and energetic. I played outside in the rain, hung out in my garden, talking to and touching my flowers, listened to some happy bluegrass music, and chatted with Dale and Missy. I sang along to my music, danced a little bit, and played a little bit of guitar with Dale. Eventually Dale told me I wanted to be alone for a little while, so that left me to refocus and remember the intention of my trip in the first place. Missy told me that she was concerned I wasn't tripping as hard as she thought 3.5 grams should make me after 2 hours. She mentioned the possibility of giving me a little bit more. I was scared to take more because I was already having a great time socialising and remembered my uncomfortable trip from the previous weekend. And I was also scared to be alone, now that Dale was doing his own thing. I misconstrued the original intention of my trip, and got in my head that the purpose of my trip was actually to face my fears head on. Well, I was scared to eat more mushrooms, and I was scared to be alone. So, I figured I should probably eat more mushrooms and go be alone. Missy gave me 1.5 more grams, and I retreated to my bedroom to eat them, and see what they would tell me to do. I heard Dale playing Pink Floyd while Missy was measuring out my mushrooms for me, and I figured that was a good idea. When I got to my room, I asked Missy to cue up The Dark Side of the Moon, and my mind was completely blown. I was so happy listening to it at full volume, dancing around and singing in my colourful bedroom to an album that was a huge part of my childhood. I had thoughts of me, and realised that I am important, and that it was okay to focus on me right now. I remembered how much I love to sing, and how big of a role music plays in my life. I had thoughts of, I am loved, I do love, I am love, while dancing, and I repeated this mantra to myself very often. I've always been scared of the album The Wall. For one, it's a terrifying album to begin with, but now it triggers lots of uncomfortable and painful memories. I asked Missy to cue the album up in its entirety after The Dark Side of the Moon, because I was still convinced that I needed to face all of my deepest fears that night. The songs Mother and Comfortably Numb have always been difficult for me to listen to since my mother's passing. After losing my mum, my dad still played and sang Mother on his guitar all the time, and I never told him how much it truly bothered me. I bought The Wall when I was in middle school, and I vividly remember going directly to the hospital from the record store to proudly show it off to my mum and play it for her. She was barely lucid, and she tried to sing along to Comfortably Numb with me while holding my hand, and I was determined to listen to the album that terrifies me the most during this trip. I felt that if I could make it through the whole album, I could beat whatever was wrong with me. While The Dark Side of the Moon was still playing, I started looking through an old notebook on my nightstand that had started as a dream journal. This became a regular journal, and had eventually petered out to serve as random scrap paper for various notes and scribbles over the past year or so. I knew that I had written some very angry passages about a man I was previously involved with, who was a very, very bad guy. This man had degraded me, shattered my sexual self-esteem, and had left me emotionally scarred in too many ways to count. I was determined to go back and read the words I hadn't thought about since they were written. I felt as if I needed to relive these evil experiences to beat them or move on from them. On the way to find those passages, I read about a dream I wrote about the 9th anniversary of my mother's death. It seemed like a happy dream, with great friends and happy memories. It even mentioned snuggling and playing with my childhood dog, who we had lost about 6 years prior to the dream. This got me thinking about my own dog that I'd lost to cancer at 3 years old, less than a year ago. I asked Missy and Dale to grab me my box of his things out the garage so I could smell him and feel him with me. I felt that if I let out all my emotions about my dead dog right there and then, that I would be able to move on and be okay. Then The Wall started, and I was elated. I was so excited to be tackling this album, these songs that had been haunting me for over half of my life. I continued dancing around and yelling and singing. Mother eventually came on, and I instantly got sad. I went to the bathroom, stayed there for a little while, then made myself go back into the bedroom. I needed to get through this album. I finally turned the music down a little bit. My sadness had turned into fear and panic. I was sweating uncontrollably and needed to do something about it. I brought the music to the dark bathroom and took a cold shower. I returned to my room, soaking wet, naked and freezing, standing in front of my fan, running full blast. I looked at my warm and cozy bed, but wouldn't let myself get in it. I looked at the warm and cozy clothes that I had laid out for myself before the trip, but would not let myself put them on. I was shivering, and the scary music was still playing. I finally, physically, took a step backwards, and realised that I was literally, physically torturing myself. In that moment, I told myself that this is what I needed to be doing in order to get through this miserable album. After a bit of this, I eventually put a t-shirt on and decided enough was enough. I made my way to Missy's room and tried to explain to her what had been going on. I felt myself starting to go into a panic attack. She got me into bed with her, held me, soothed me, and eventually I let myself give in while realising it is okay to need people sometimes. Missy asked me lots of questions that I did not have the capacity to answer. All I could get across was that I was feeling bad, dark energies. No one thing in particular, not even a scattering of thoughts, just bad. She told me that we should reset my surroundings and play some calmer music and turn some lights on. But we didn't make it that far. She posted up in the living room with me and started hearing me out. I then experienced every wave of emotion. I told Missy things about my mother that I hadn't told anyone before or barely even dared to think about. I am so scared of forgetting my mother. However, my most vivid memories of her are extremely traumatizing and horrifying and excruciatingly hard to think about. I finally accepted that I am traumatized. Instead of denying it or insisting that being tough means I can't be affected by trauma, I am deeply affected by this trauma, and always will be. I cried fully and deeply about my dog, and everyone I have lost in this life and how it is so hard to continue living without them here. Missy reminded me that darkness is just a curtain. All you need to do is pull it aside to see the light. I admitted that I have had passive suicidal thoughts, i.e. long drives home at night as a teenager, thinking, what if I just keep driving straight off the road instead of turning with this curve? Hell, I even had that thought last week driving down a Colorado mountain pass at 10 p.m. Missy told me she does not believe that these are in fact suicidal thoughts. She told me she believes that I know how fragile life is more than anyone, and that I realise how something I actually hold so precious could be gone in an instant. Finally admitting these thoughts that have existed for years to myself and out loud immediately removed a massive weight off my chest. I realised that Missy was absolutely right, that I truly love life, and that I never have had thoughts of how I won't be missed, how nobody truly loves me, how the world will be better off without me in it, etc., because I know that I am truly loved by those in my life. Things are slowly starting to come together here. Thoughts of, I am loved, I do love, I am love, make their way back into my mind. Missy, still sitting there with me, was living proof that I am loved. We continued talking about my hard-ass upbringing and a strict, emotionless family. We also talked about the good things in my upbringing. Throughout the trip, I realised more and more how influential music truly has been in my life. My dad plays guitar and loves to sing, and our house was always filled with music. He and I even had a game we would play in the car when a song came on the radio. The first one to correctly name the song and band won. Over the years I started to beat him more and more often, and I still remember when he finally admitted that my musical education is complete. I was so proud. My brother is an insanely talented musician. He's one of those genius types you only see in movies or read about in books. He's heavily influenced my musical taste and standards. I played in the school band growing up, but mostly I loved singing in the jazz choir and singing to myself. I am terribly self-conscious of my voice though, for no good reason. But singing makes me happy, and I'm going to do it more from now on. I want to be a creator, and finally get serious about learning how to play guitar well enough to sing along and play some simple jams with friends. I realised I have recently given up on learning guitar because I'm coming to terms with actually missing a man that I was with this past winter. He meant more to me than I wanted to admit, and his leaving hurt me more than I wanted to admit. He was a wonderful guitar player with a wonderful voice, and I loved the music he brought into my world, and I do miss him terribly, but I only hope the best for him now. Falling asleep that night, I thought about him once more. Even though I miss him, he hurt me in a big way, and I do not deserve to have anyone in my life that can treat the people that care about them so very badly. Missy continuously asked why I'm so mean to and hard on myself. I admitted that I don't want to be happy. I can say I want to be happy all I want, but I know it's not true. I recalled 2 recent events of close friends telling me how generous they think I am. I don't see myself this way, and admit that I don't actually want to. I told her more about losing my dog. She commented on all the parallels between caregiving for him and ultimately losing him to cancer, just like with my mum. I hysterically cried more and more, and felt more weight being released from my chest. I had jokingly thrown out, while drinking with buddies a couple times over the past few weeks, that losing my dog was the hardest thing I have ever gone through. I'd been thinking about it more, immediately feeling guilty because, how could losing a dog be worse than losing a parent? Then, in that moment, I came to realise it is the honest-to-God truth. Though losing my mother was excruciatingly painful and will forever haunt me, I know I always have my family to fall back on. I always had and always will have my brother and dad. I went through it with both sets of my grandparents, my aunts and uncles and cousins, all of my friends and all of her friends. She was so very loved by everyone who knew her, and we all suffered this loss together. When it came to caretaking for and losing my dog, I had never felt more alone. He was mine and mine alone. No one had, and no one could, ever understand the relationship we shared. He was my responsibility. I was supposed to take care of him and save him, but I could not. No matter what I did, I couldn't save him. I was his mother, and I failed him. At some point, Comfortably Numb came on in the background. I told Missy the story of my mum in the hospital, and she offered to change it for me. I told her no, and we listened to it together. While we continued to talk, the rest of the war finished quietly in the background. I made it through the album that scares me the most of all. All I needed was a friend by my side. Things got better from there. My panic had completely subsided by this time, and I was ready to listen to Missy's guidance. She told me I should think about treating myself like a little kid. How would you feel if you treated your 8-year-old self like you treat yourself now? I told her, I would feel like a complete monster. She asked me all of the right questions and helped me to reflect on everything I had learnt during the trip. What fascinates me the most is the way the mushrooms had to make me physically torture myself to make me understand how I'm treating myself emotionally. I realised that my self-torture is much deeper than superficial boy problems. I mentally torture myself in every way and refuse to let myself be happy, because I'm so comfortable and familiar with my misery. I'm stuck in this depressive cycle with no desire to get out, and I now realise that it is harder for me to be happy than sad or angry. So if I can't be happy, then I might as well focus on making myself miserable, because at least then I'm in control of something. I am so proud of myself for removing myself from my wet, naked, shivering, overstimulated and terrified state, and getting warm and seeking help in my friends. It feels very symbolic in that I never have to be alone if I don't want to be. I don't have to continuously torture myself or beat myself up, because it is a truly miserable state to be in, and I hated feeling trapped in that situation, just like I've been feeling trapped in my own depressive cycle. Now, I know that all I have to do is ask for help, and my friends who love me will be more than willing. It is okay to need people. It is okay to not be okay. It's how you handle not being okay that matters. It is impossible to fully describe how empowering, powerful, moving, humbling, transformative and life-changing this trip was for me. In short, my takeaways from this journey are that I need to start treating myself how I treat my friends, because I am a wonderful friend. If I wasn't, I would not have so many amazing and loving people in my life. Music is everything. Love is everything. I am loved, I do love, I am love. I need to be kinder to myself. Ego and self-love are in fact different things. Self-love is not selfishness. The way to beat your demons is not with anger. Facing them head-on does not need to be malicious, spiteful or hateful. My demons are a part of me, and therefore I must love them like I love myself. Approach them calmly, and work with them to free myself of them forever. This trip was by no means a cure-all, but it has given me endless things to think about and work on and towards. Once you get the message, hang up the phone. I wrote a quick journal entry at the end of the night before bed. I thought it was incredibly sweet and I'd love to share it. I love singing, and mushrooms and Missy. Sing more, actually learn guitar. Love on your demons, instead of feeling like you need to tackle them. Facing things doesn't need to be angry or scary. You can have a nice, rational and loving conversation with them and just tell them to go away, please. I love you. I fell asleep with a smile on my face for the first time that I can remember. Dying and Meeting God. A ketamine trip report by Keta D. Posted to EARBUDS.org June 3rd, 2005. I was 46 years old when I took enough ketamine to enter the K-hole during a camping trip with some hippies in England. A friend who I know well, a dealer in psychedelics, gave me some K. This experience right here was my first full-on trip into the K-hole, a visionary experience. I had taken smaller amounts before and was upgrading my dosage, so I wasn't really a novice. I went into my tent, made myself comfortable, and snorted 5 fat lines, about 250 milligrams, at 8 PM. I intended to have an experience of some psychedelic sort, but was not expecting anything triggering an NDE-like experience. As soon as the horrible taste of the chemical rose in my throat, I lost all awareness of my body. I did not know who I was and where I was, and I was subject to pure visuals. The exact details I cannot quite remember, only that I was pure being and was in a world of constantly changing patterns and stripes, resembling a fractal deep within the Mandelbrot. I had no sense of time, whether of past, present or future, so I could say I was in a roller coaster ride in a multi-dimensional giant fractal for eternity. And this went on and 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 on. Eventually, very occasionally, some fleeting thoughts emerged, such as, I must have died. I must have poisoned myself. This must be what it's like when you die. I had no awareness of how I actually came to be here. Only occasionally though, really, as I was constantly rolling about in a stripy universe of shapes and sliding walls and sudden shifts. I began to feel a little lonely and frightened, as there was no one else in this universe. Be centered, I said to myself, and kept my awareness centered. I could feel a sense of time pulsating slow and fast, but there was still no sense of past or future. I was still unaware of my identity or name, or of where I came from. Then, while observing a pattern resembling a part of the Mandelbrot fractal, a whole bunch of association with the word K emerged. Kate, 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 Kate. Then I realised it was something I took, and it was called K. And it reminded me of my sister, who unfortunately had died the previous year from cancer. Plus chains of thoughts and feelings sometimes linked to do with police, hospital, who was with my friends, not hurting other people, and so consequently I will not get hurt. Then I wondered if there was hell, and the patterned universe became red and foggy, with sheets of flame. Eternal, I thought. Oh, help, I don't want to get roasted here for eternity. The universe polarised into 2 parts, the red hell on the lower half, and a white foggy upper half, except there was a sphere of white light shining through the fog, and he was God, with the capital G. He radiated pure awe, a mixture of love, light and power radiating from him. I went to God to merge with him, in order to escape from hell. There was this overwhelming feeling of oneness, and then a comforting, secure feeling, and then an understanding that I'd done something stupid and shouldn't actually be here. And so, he sent me away. He wasn't going to send me to hell, mind you. Apparently that was reserved for killers, and it's actually not even eternal. So there actually was only one way out. Right back through the fractal again. So here there was more of the same, visuals, and except it was actually getting a bit more rainbow-like. It was accompanied by cycles and waves of a wide range of emotions ranging from bliss, serenity, happiness, contentment, to loneliness, anxiety, and fear. I began to be aware of my head, but not the rest of my body, and I was paralysed. I felt my mouth fill with spittle and could not turn my head, so all I could do was gargle. Eventually, bits and pieces were coming together. I was in a tent, but I didn't know where. I recalled my name, I guess. I guess it was at a camp. I was sort of remembering where I was, but not quite. I was able to move a bit, but that's all. I opened my eye, and it was now dark. Surely some time had passed. I wanted to reach out into my bag beside me, but couldn't find it. My hand kept reaching out for the bag, but saw many hands, many bags, and they were dancing all over the place. I didn't know which hand should reach out for which bag. Also, I felt very dizzy whenever I moved my head. If I just stayed still and closed my eyes and see patterns, I felt quite okay. But then I felt sick, so I miraculously unzipped my tent door, stuck my head out and chundered. It was raining heavily now, and there was a mighty flash of lightning and a loud rumble of thunder. I chundered a few more times in like manner. Then I realised that it was at least 2 hours since I'd actually insufflated the K. I decided to go to sleep. I even had this dream that I took a tab of LSD and went on a full-blown trip. I woke and staggered to the campfire, someone was up and we had a cup of tea, and then he said it was about 4 AM. So here's some of my comments on this experience. My spiritual beliefs closely approximates to reincarnation, karma yoga, and developing an inner peace. I commune with the One through visualization. It's a being who is an orb of light that pulses with patterns of lights, sparks, and rays. She is pure love, healing, patience, and many other virtues. She is also he, as they are of both sexes. She can polymorph into Buddha, Mary, or Jesus for the benefit of the visualizer, though it appears that the glowing orb is the most basic form of the One. Also, the One may appear as Buddha or Jesus from the mental and spiritual viewpoint of the perceiver, as the light coming from the One passes through at least 4, as far as I have discovered, layers of spiritual, religious, cultural, and personal filters, and takes on form as the light passes through the perceiver's filters. The grand purpose of life appears to be merging with the One, so that we become one with the One. The more practice that we do in union with the One in this life, and avoid killing or harming people and animals, and just generate love and care, as well as releasing ourselves from all addictions, there is a greater chance of merging with the One after we die. Otherwise, we go round and round through death and rebirth until union happens, a la samsara. I don't usually take psychedelic substances really, as I prefer to maintain clarity of mind. My main spiritual practice is visualization, developing inner peace, and praying for peace in the world. If asked who I worship, I would reply a glowing white orb who is peace and love, and who is called the One. If I was asked what the purpose of life is, I would simply reply that it is union with the One. The Cosmic Joke, Reality as It Is, a 5-MeO DMT trip report by The Seeker, posted to EARBUDS.org, November 23rd, 2020. The process facilitated by 2 experienced guides. 5-MeO DMT powder, vaped, in 3 doses using glass vapor genie. T plus 0 hours, 3 milligrams. 5 minutes, 6 milligrams. 10 minutes, 12 milligrams. The 3 milligram dose I don't remember anything about. The arc of the 6 milligram dose and the 12 milligram dose was essentially the same, the symphony described below. After the 6 milligram dose I said, Don't let me forget this. I won't forget this, will I? It was so incredibly clear, and then it started to scatter, and I feared I might forget it, so I immediately went for the 12mg dose, which delivered the same experience with infinitely more clarity. In order for the lesson to be received as I received it, it was psychologically necessary to see it as having been orchestrated and delivered by someone, and my ego, once back online, attributed this skill to my guide. I have since realised that of course she did not orchestrate my inner experience, but to absorb it with the impact I did, that step was necessary. The belief that she did it was a bridge to a fuller understanding of what was learned. Backstory that may be relevant. I am an American woman in my 50s, with several kids and a successful career in healthcare. I struggled with addiction as a teenager, overcame that, struggled with more compulsive behaviours and addiction since, but they're mostly in check now. I have a lifetime history of anxiety and tendencies towards depression, with at least 2 prolonged periods of major depression in my life, that thankfully are now resolved. I have no particular trauma history, other than the trauma of being an empathic human within this world. I identified as pagan during my 20s, and as a hippie since I went to my first rainbow gathering at 21. I was raised by atheist, leftist, intellectual parents without any particular spiritual direction or tradition. I have lived with ideals of justice, egalitarianism, and freedom as my guiding principles. My highest values are truth, honesty, love, compassion, and integrity. I've been seeking non-dual awakening most of my adult life now. I began studying meditation with a 10-day Vipassana retreat in my 20s, with a meditation practice that could be described as sporadic at best since that time. I gradually dropped any identification with paganism, aside from deep reverence for the natural world, and would describe myself as a secular Zen Buddhist, sort of, if a label were needed. I've gone on 2 one-week-long silent meditation retreats with Adyashanti in the past 10 years, and have read every book I can find on the topic of non-dual awakening in that time. I believe in the scientific method and eschew magical thinking in all its forms, and yet I cannot accept materialism as a logical explanation for what is. It makes less and less sense to me the longer I live. I've lately found monistic idealism, as described by Bernardo Kastrup, to be the most intellectually satisfying explanation for what reality really is. I've been using psychedelics as a tool for understanding reality in earnest for the past 3 years. I've found the most insights from psilocybin, ketamine, and MDMA. I have experiences with LSD, MDA, and NDMT, and various other less interesting drugs though. I was a stoner for years, but I've no interest in marijuana for at least 20 years now. I have read every book and article I can find on 5-MeO-DMT in the past 3 years, and have been seeking this molecule like the holy grail in that time. It has taken 3 years to come to me. This was the correct time frame. It never was up to me. I've read many awakening experiences and never had one of my own, not really. My deepest, most secret, and shameful fear has always been that I am deluding myself, and that perhaps there is actually no truth that can be known, or that I am for some reason not worthy or capable of knowing it. My terror was that I might die without ever having been absolutely sure of anything at all. The symphony in movements. The deconstruction. As the smoke leaves my lungs and gentle fractals whirl extremely rapidly, awareness focuses into a tunnel heading towards a point. I've been training for this my whole life, is my last thought in words. Every life experience is instantly seen as relevant and then discarded, peeled away, released, into a gem of meaning consolidated into the elegant unified path of understanding unfolding within. All identities released, all self-inquiry absorbed, all non-dual intellectual understandings metabolized, all meditation experiences understood, all psychedelic lessons integrated. The pinnacle. Everything falls away. The sum total of my life's quest is balanced on a tiny silent pinnacle, and there is no further path ahead. A feeling of uncertainty, apprehension, nowhere to turn. What now? A pause. The void. The pinnacle vanishes. The gem of the sum total of my life's quest silently goes poof. There is nothing. There is nothing. There is nothing. The sensation is abject. Utterly lost. No one to orient and no experience to orient to. Drifting, writhing with utter helplessness in the void. There is no coming back from here. It was nothing all along. This is not a metaphor. This is the absolute reality. There is no one to have an emotion, but if there were, it would be one of existential horror and futility and ultimate aloneness. The gathering of energy. From the writhing, helpless drifting, energy begins to swirl and grow and gather. Colours of deep blue and purple, like liquid metal, swirling in a cosmic whirlpool, pressure growing, all the energies of the void collapsing together with incredible velocity and infinite force. There is something again. That which would orient tries to find the orientation to the rising energy as it grows to infinite intensity and focuses into a singular point. The singularity, the realization, the ultimate irreversible surrender. The energy collapses into a singularity containing all of space and time and awareness. Absolute pure reality as it is. Utter certainty. The I am. Surprise, shock, realization, ecstasy, as the single pure shining high note of reality as it is shatters the person, destroys it with joy, with no turning back. This is all that matters. This is all that is. Transcendent understanding. Absolute certainty. All that once seemed important is moot here at the end of the story. Everywhere and nowhere. The understanding is embraced with urgency and abandon. The obviousness is overwhelming. At the core of reality there is ultimate certainty. This is worth every sacrifice, and surrender is total. The supernova of reality as it is. The singularity gives birth to reality as it is in a supernova, a bit like a cosmic orgasm. Reality as it is without orientation. All prior concepts are seen as pure illusion, laughable, hilarious in fact. The idea that a person's ideas about reality have any relevance to anything at all is fucking hilarious. The idea that there is something to be attained is fucking hilarious as well. I get it. The full force of the joke hits me now. The mastery of the setup, destruction, and revelation hits me. My guide is holding my hand, smiling a smile that confirms to me at the deepest level what I already know, which is this truth can never be unseen. Nothing has ever mattered, and that this is the cosmic joke, and it was masterful. Not a step was missed, not a motion wasted in the execution of this lesson. The impact has destroyed me, and I am so grateful, and I just say to her fiercely, that was perfect. You are a master. You're a fucking artist. The fall and the impossibility of anything mattering. Identity returns and, well, it is meaningless. It is hilarious. The idea that the only true thing in existence once seen could be forgotten is hilarious. Everything is hilarious. I laugh and laugh and laugh. Every idea that occurs to me is just the funniest thing ever. The idea that anything could ever have mattered is stupidly funny. I laugh and writhe and kick my feet. I feel totally naked now. All lies and self-deception are destroyed because, well, who would lie to whom? How would we ever fake anything? Nothing matters. I am reborn into truth. I am liberated. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you, I say. Ideas and concepts are drifting tatters around me, and I understand why people act so unpredictable and crazy after they smoke 5-MeO. It's impossible to self-censor. There is no one to censor. It cannot be done. The I that emerges is not the one who went in now. Nothing will ever be the same, and this is clear. I laugh and laugh and laugh for half an hour at least, my beloveds looking on with love and questions and a bit of apprehension in their eyes. I can't tell them. This cannot be told. Only my guide knows now. You are a fucking artist, you know, I tell her again, needing to express this in some way. I've never had a psychedelic experience like that. That's what I've been looking for. Thank you. Thank you. I'm now done. I never need to have another experience in my life. This was it. The after effects. The effect of this destruction has been overwhelming. I was deeply blessed to have an amazing community of chosen family with me on this retreat, who have held me as I laugh and cry and am unable to cook or eat or even hold a conversation. There are layers upon layers of understandings unfolding. There has been joy and fear and ongoing reactivations in which the sensation of part of the experience overcomes me. This has occurred in others as well. This molecule is not a drug. I do not recommend this for partiers, thrill seekers, or mildly curious psychonauts. I'm only at the beginning of this process, 1 week in. Not sure how I'll be able to function at work tomorrow for my first day back since this experience. Everything has changed in ways I just cannot understand. But there is no undoing this, and this is what I wanted. I cannot stress enough how absolutely important it is for physical, psychological, and spiritual safety to do this with an experienced guide and a strong, trusted container of supportive people to hold you afterwards. I do moderate to high dose psychedelics in my bedroom with my partner on the regular. One of the things I shouted hysterically in my uncontrolled laughter at the end of this experience was, "Imagine doing this alone in your bedroom." Gales of laughter. This one is real. I have long believed that the quote below is true. I hoped, I trusted, but now I know. Knowing is different. You live in illusion and the appearance of things. There is a reality. You are that reality. When you understand this, you see that you are nothing, and being nothing, you are everything. That is all. Kalu Rinpoche. Sacred Laughter and the Unknown. A 4-ACE Toxie, DIPT, DPT, and Cannabis Trip Report by Catfish Rivers. Posted to EARBUDS.org, August 27th, 2001. I started this experiment already 2 steps ahead of myself. This, being my first experience with 4-ACE DIPT, the plan was to take it without mixing any other drugs with it, except for cannabis, and to take it by myself, so that I could concentrate on the new terrain I was aiming to explore. However, I met up with a friend and his roommate, both of whom have spent time mapping out the paths that led to the other world with me. M was excited to try out this new substance. S, however, is rather apprehensive about trying most of these newfangled research chemicals. He has enjoyed 5-MeO-DMT, which he only knows by the nickname Sprinkles, arising from the fact that it is sprinkled over the top of the bowl, but nothing else really. So, in the name of inclusion, I whipped out my DPT and explained the similarities between the two, and the differences. S listened with a look of heavy concentration, and by the end of the lecture by Professor Drugs, he was giddy with anticipation. And so, the experiment began. 10 PM. I've just come off a particularly unsettling shift at work. I'm a behavioural health counsellor for the geriatric, and had spent the evening in the hospital with a confused and disorientated woman who had fallen earlier during the day and now lay prostrate in the hospital bed, not knowing the year, the president, or how she fell in the first place. The experience left me drained physically and emotionally. I seriously was debating whether I wanted to follow through with the plan before meeting up with my friends. After a friendly bowl of cannabis and some laughs, my mood had diffused itself somewhat, and I was ready and willing once again. So, without further ado, M and I took 31 milligrams of 4-ACO DIPT orally in a gel cap. 10:15. A bowl is packed with some high quality cannabis and approximately 100 milligrams of DPT freebase oil. The bowl was shared amongst the 3 of us, although M and I bowed out after 3 hits each to allow some space in our heads for the 4-ACO DIPT to develop. S finished the bowl, which lasted several more tokes. Within 5 minutes, the 3 of us were donning our best permagrin smiles. I am well versed in the effects of DPT, and believe I can detect the first inklings of the 4-ACO DIPT by the 20-minute mark. It's hard to pin down at this point, especially considering the fact that I'm already flying my kite on DPT, but I think I can feel the start of the reported body high. It is somewhat similar to the somatic sensations induced by 5-MeO DIPT. My arms, legs and head are all pleasant to touch. Happy pins and needles are pushing goosebumps up through my skin. I'm reminded of the chills one gets at a touching scene in a movie. 10:45. I am well into the ascent of the 4-ACO DIPT now. Laughter fills the room like smoke, and as we move further into the experience, my mood is very much elevated from the start of the night. All touches of darkness have been removed from my mood. I feel carefree and relaxed. I can sense currents of somatic pleasure pulsing through my body. There is a wonderful rush blossoming in my chest. M is laying on the couch, bouncing his arms and legs, and reminds me of a piece of bacon frying. He reports feeling awesome. S reports experiencing visuals from the DPT and is quite excited as well. M and I are not having any visuals, outside of perhaps the sparkle sheen that coats everything when the pupils become dark swallowing moons. Colours also seem enhanced or brightened somewhat. 11:30. Another bowl of cannabis with approximately 50 milligrams of DPT is smoked by S and I. M reports that he is well stoked and needs no additives at the moment. After 3 hits, the shaggy carpet begins to wall and dance. I imagine rug dervishes performing sacred dances for the ceiling gods, who busy themselves making the walls breathe in and out. I'm reminded of the scene from The Matrix, after Neo realizes his true potential and makes the walls of the hallway bulge out. I'm really quite overwhelmed by the amount of movement going on, but being that my mood is absolutely glowing, I take it in stride and lie back to enjoy the fireworks. The semantic centres of my brain are also quite well lubed by this point, as I'm spawning humorous babblings faster than rabbits on Viagra in the spring. M, on the other hand, reports feeling characteristically slow and introverted, but he always gets this way on psychedelics. A passage from the Quran floats through my consciousness, which says something to the effect of, "The gates of paradise open wide for he who can make his companions laugh." I very much enjoy the idea of sacred laughter. If there was ever a thing to build a religion around, it is laughter itself. I'm quite positively +++ right now. 12 AM. No real visuals to speak of anymore. Some random blips and trails, but nothing consistent. I look at myself in the mirror and notice that my pupils are nearly touching the whites of my eyes. A Lilliputian aeroplane could fly right through one of them into my brain. My mood is still ecstatic. I'm enjoying the body high, touching anything soft that is in reach of my blissed out physical form lying across the rug. My hands feel a bit balmy, but it doesn't bother me much. I begin to notice that time seems to be moving incredibly slow. I feel as if my brain has been spinning its psychedelic wheels for at least 6 hours. But alas, it has only been 2. I report this to M, who agrees that his sense of time is stretched out. This will be a theme with me for the rest of the experience. I am constantly amazed when I check the time to see how little time has actually passed. Meanwhile, my subjective clock is ticking faster than it can talk. 12:30. M and I retire to his room to watch Pokemon 3 the movie. We smoke a few bong hits each and flick on the lava lamp for some ambience. I'm blown away by the underlying philosophies present in the movie, and am delighted in the fact that this is what is brainwashing kids today. A new Pokemon, called Unknown, which are a living alphabet of sorts, are introduced. These Pokemon fascinate me due to their ability to feed off the psychic energies of a person and create a virtual dream world into which the person is transported. I'm reminded of the language of DNA and of the Kabbalah, and also of the action of psychedelic drugs. Just as I start to delve in deep to the inner workings of Pokemon philosophy, S walks by the room and lets out a sing-songy mocking about M and I, 2 adult men, watching Pokemon. For the next 30 minutes, I am trapped inside a mental whirlpool of justifying to myself that it is perfectly valid for a grown man to search for spiritual meaning in Pokemon. After I realise just what I am doing, I lose myself in a fit of giggles. The whole scenario strikes me as absolutely ludicrous. 2 AM. M and I move out to his deck and smoke a joint. I am amazed at the wall of sound erected by the creatures of the night. Peepers are peeping, the crickets are busy creating a static of leg noise, locusts are buzzing in a sort of call and response, while M and I fill the air with smoke and flapdoodle. The stars are winking and doing their pixie dances. It feels so good to be outside. The cool night air is causing a fresh wave of goosebumps to arise out of the persistent body buzz. I start to emit a low om sound, in tune with the night symphony. Closed-eye visuals run rampant through my mind with the speed and intensity of an electric current. I am starting to feel worn down and tired now, although my body is loose and relaxed. I imagine swimming right now would be excellent, but there is no water around. 3:30. I start to feel like my grandfather, who would insist he was looking for holes in his eyelids when I would catch him nodding off in his easy chair as I sit closed-eyed, telling M that I am not really tired, that my eyes are only closed, that I can study my closed-eye visuals. Soon enough though, I admit that I am actually exhausted and head off to sleep, which comes effortlessly and quick. To be honest, I am actually quite enamoured with 4-ACO-DIPT, although I still need to experience it by itself to be sure. The best and shortest analogy I can give to describe it is that 4-ACO-DIPT is what LSD would be if it were MDMA in another universe. I found it to induce a headspace somewhat akin to a candy flip experience, although shorter and accompanied by a body buzz similar but more pleasant than 5-MeO-DIPT. It was better due to the fact that I experienced clearly no negative side effects. I also found it to carry a strong, empathic quality, and all in all, 4-ACO-DIPT has truly won my favour. Sedona Sunshine, an Al-Lad trip report by M. posted to EARBUDS.org August 31st, 2013. Note: I had no recollection of time throughout this experience, so I'll just describe the night as I remember it. I had taken one blotter about a month before this and had a very nice experience, one that I thought was worth a trip report. Well, being in Sedona, one of the most spiritual places in the country, on top of taking a higher dose, gave me an experience I will never forget. Myself and 4 friends were on a backpacking trip in Sedona, and we arrived at the national park at about 5 PM after driving 40 minutes on a dirt road. We were anxious to trip while the sun was still up, so we rushed to our hike. After about 45 minutes of hiking, my friend T, remember, friend T is tripping, and I dropped 1.5 blotters each. We continued to find a good place to set up our tents. 30 minutes later, we've arrived at a perfect clearing with beautiful views of the red rocks and horizon for the sunset. I'm starting to feel spacey, and I start to get a little nervous. I haven't even become acclimated to our campsite yet, and I'm already starting to come up hard. Somehow, I set up my tent, and I look to my friend T. With an uncomfortable look on his face, he says, "I don't even know how you did that, I'm tripping balls." This was T's first time trying a psychedelic drug, and I was somewhat nervous for him and how he would handle it. Naturally, I start to worry a bit after seeing the look on his face. I decide to remove myself from the campsite that there is literally nothing to do at, so that I can enjoy my trip and come up in peace. I start to walk up this red rock hill looking for a place to meditate. There is no comfortable place to sit anywhere. I keep walking, thinking to myself, oh come on, you're tripping acid in Sedona. The universe is going to give you a perfect spot to sit. Sure enough, there is a single flat rock that looked comfortable to sit on, with 2 little flowers growing on each side of it. I shit you not. I sit down and start to focus on my breathing. Instantly, I'm in another world. My thoughts are so deep and complex that I completely separate from reality. I snap back, and I bring back a deep vibrating sound that continues around me. It was kind of a whoop, whoop, whoop sort of vibration. And I thought to myself, it's the earth. Sure enough, I hear a higher pitch vibration, and I knew instantly that it was mine. I open my eyes, and for the first time ever, I see patterns. It was beautiful. I'd read so much about psychedelics and about people's experiences that I thought I understood what it meant to see patterns. But nah, experiencing them for myself was surreal. I saw the flower of life creating a dome around me, along with fractals and many other geometric shapes. They didn't look solid, but almost holographic. The sky was purple, and the orange of the sunset was created by each colour of the spectrum, and I could see it all. In this moment, it felt like the weight of the universe was being pushed in on me all at once. It was very intense, and I actually couldn't move. I'm convinced that the chemical is only half of the reason I'm tripping my balls off right now. The other half is the landscape. Sedona is the most spiritual place in our country, with high electromagnetic energy, energy vortexes, and twisting juniper trees. This is so intense because this land is so high in energy, I'm convinced. I hear my friends M and T coming up the hill looking for me. They sound very worried. I called them over and the look on T's face hasn't changed much. He is able to laugh at things but would regain that nervous look quite often. The sun was going down, so we walked back to the campsite. Light is bouncing off of all the little plants on the ground, making everything look spiky, a bit like a cactus. When we get back to the campsite, we face the same problem again. An empty space with nothing to do in it. I begin to try and explain the experience I just had to my friend and find that I cannot. I'd get halfway through a sentence and my mind would be 10 steps ahead. It was rather frustrating. I look to T again and ask him what he's seeing. Dude, how are you even holding a conversation? I don't even know how you're doing it. I need to just go trip in the tent. I reckon I'll feel better in there, he said. I joined him. We sat in the tent and tried to gather our thoughts. My consciousness leaves my body twice. My head would just float into empty space, and when I would come back to reality, I literally had to check if I'd shit myself. Well, that's enough of that, I say to myself while I get out the tent. At this point, I'm pretty sure I've taken too much, and I'm not going to have a good trip whatsoever, because up until now it was just so much to handle. I started to become anxious, so I grabbed a glow stick out of my pack. My friend B makes a toy out of it for me and starts to swing it around in circles very fast. B, you have no idea what you're actually creating right now, I said to him. At this point, I was not amused by the trails of the glow stick. I was amused by the patterns that were being created on the inside of the circle. It was a very vivid flower of life that became more complex when he would spin it fast and became simpler when he would spin it slowly. After T and I had enough of the trippy green light, we looked up at the sky. It was the clearest we have ever seen the Milky Way. At this moment, T and I both broke out of our intense come-ups and were peeking. All we just wanted to do right now was go back up on that hill and stare at the stars. The Milky Way was so clear to me that it looked as if someone had been holding a flashlight behind it and was even moving it around, which allowed me to see each section of it in great detail. We walked up the same hill I'd meditated on and started taking open exposure pictures of the stars. And after about an hour or so of talking about life, existence, materialism, perception, pretty much anything, I took the greatest picture of the stars. This sheer beauty helped me come to realize, with the help of M and T, the most beautiful life realization I could have come to. To top it off, there were 2 consecutive shooting stars. I started sobbing. I honestly couldn't help it. I'd never been so content, so sure, so happy, so amazed in my life, and for all of it to happen at once was honestly incredible. It was the single greatest moment of my life, and I genuinely couldn't believe it. It was as if my entire life had come full circle, and there was nothing else except that very moment. Unfortunately though, the realization will be kept between M and T and the ones closest to me, because it was far too life-changing and so very personal. After another hour of talking with M and T, we heard a disturbing noise come from towards the campsite. It honestly sounded like a dying animal. The sound recurred 3 more times, and we decided we should go make sure our 2 other friends were alright. We never found out what the sound was, but at this point, we were coming down after what felt to be about 6 hours of a trip. Before getting into our tents, T and I just stood there in silence, trying to piece together what happened those few hours. It was hard to think anymore. Our brains felt like a library with no books left to read. So we get into our sleeping bags and pass out easily. Waking up the next morning was great. We watched the sunrise over the mountains, cleaned up the campsite. Feeling refreshed and in a clear state of mind, the trip was honestly everything we had hoped. We hiked out and took one last look back on the canyon that had changed our lives, and then headed back. video starts, I wanted to give a quick shout out to what is quite possibly the most apt sponsorship I've ever come across for Vivec. Oftentimes I'll decline, 99.9% of sponsorship deals I come across because I just don't think Raid Shadow Legends is very appropriate for the sort of content on this channel. But I know a lot of you like to fall asleep to these report videos, and that's why I thought these COZYSNUG sleep earbuds from LYTMI really are a match made in heaven for this channel and its viewers. If you're anything like me, you might struggle falling to sleep on your back with conventional earbuds in. I'd always wondered whether there were any designs that facilitated side sleeping without waking up with a perforated eardrum. Not only do these earbuds work wonders for side sleepers, they boast high quality audio, are super lightweight and soft with various different sizes of ear wings to pick and choose from, on top of having 21 hours of charge when using the charging case. So, now you can all quickly and smoothly fall asleep listening to me recount the usual litany of mind-bending, reality-shattering experiences that we all know and love. If you're interested, please check out the link in the description, and don't forget to use the discount code Vivec for 10% off your order, valid up until the 9th of December. Anyway, we'll crack on with the video now, but be sure to let me know what you thought of the earbuds if you do end up snatching yourself a pair, and thank you to LYTMI for reaching out, I really appreciate it. Turned Inside Out. A Mescaline and LSD Trip Report by Ivan Nakuvanich. Posted to EARBUDS.org September 28, 2011. About me. In high school, I habitually smoked marijuana, frequently consumed opiates, and tripped a few dozen times on whatever was available, which was usually LSD, mushrooms, or MDMA. Looking back, I buried my grief, self-loathing, and anger with heavy drug use. I used psychedelic drugs as an escape from my feelings, rather than as powerful tools for self-improvement. My attitude has since changed though. At the end of high school, with the aid of my family and some encouragement from the state, I went to treatment, and I remained sober for nearly 4 years. During this time, I obtained a BS in chemistry, and I'm now working towards a PhD. As time progressed, I questioned whether I could responsibly use drugs at all. I started drinking moderately and occasionally using marijuana, LSD, and mescaline. It has now been 2 years since I made the decision to use again, and things do seem to be under control. I only mention this here because I feel it is important to understand the background of a person who's reporting a trip. Preparation. About a year ago, a bottle of methyl 3,4,5-trimethoxybenzoate arrived at my lab. For several months, I pondered how I would, and whether I should, make mescaline from this chemical. Finally, over the summer, I decided to take action. I followed Makepeace Usau's 1951 synthesis of mescaline, but with a few modern improvements. First, it was to form 3,4,5-trimethoxybenzyl chloride from 3,4,5-trimethoxybenzyl alcohol. I used SOCI2 instead of concentrated HCl. My second improvement was to use 18 Crown 6 and KCN in DMF in order to form 3,4,5-trimethoxyphenyl acetonitrile from 3,4,5-trimethoxybenzyl chloride, as opposed to Sau's use of KCN in a water-methanol mixture. Both of my modifications increase the yields. Perhaps in the future I will submit my work to the chemistry archives. The end result of my hard work was roughly 5 grams of slightly off-white mescaline hydrochloride, the structure of which was confirmed by proton NMR and IR spectroscopy. The setting. Over the course of the summer, I tripped a half dozen times on mescaline with amounts that varied from 200 to 450 milligrams. In short, I was well acquainted with my new chemical friend by the time I took this trip. In the final week of summer, I went to a concert and I brought with me 2 400mg doses of mescaline. My buddy Jay was at the previous night's show, during which he took some LSD. He was camped out with about 30 people, most of whom were complete strangers to me. I don't usually trip at concerts or take multiple drugs at once. Nevertheless, Jay and I each took some LSD and mescaline before the show. Note, only the drugs mentioned in this report were consumed. The trip. At 6 PM, 2 hours before the show, Jay and I each took about 100 micrograms of some liquid LSD that had been well tested throughout the summer by our friends. Era would note, claims of measured microgram dosage for LSD are usually unsupported. Quantitative measurements for LSD are very difficult to do and cannot be done casually. Without further detailed information about how the measurements were derived, it is reasonable to assume that most statements of microgram dosages of LSD on blotter or in microdots are either misinformed or overstated. T plus 20 minutes. I began to notice the effects of the acid. It was nothing more than mild euphoria and an increase in energy. 35 minutes. The trees were gently swirling and waving to me. I could tell that I had taken enough acid to have a mild trip at least. It was then that Jay and I decided to consume some mescaline at 200 milligrams each. 1 hour. As planned, we each consumed another 200 milligrams of mescaline. At this point, I was in an odd place halfway between tripping on acid and coming up on mescaline. I was tense and anxious, but at the same time very much intrigued by the ground and trees. Communication was easy, but I was altogether uninterested in talking. 1.75 hours. We went into the venue to find our places. Jay had a seat in a different area than me, so I sat with another friend, Kay. I was still stuck in limbo between two trips, but the tenseness of the mescaline started to subside. Minor patterns began to flow through the sky, and everything was rippling with rainbows. 2.25 to 3.5 hours. Wow. I mean, wow. The show had begun, and the music was explosive, but it filled me with a peace I've never actually experienced before. I literally sat down in the middle of a crowded venue and meditated. Occasionally, a caring stranger would tap on my shoulder and make sure I was okay, to which I would give a reassuring smile. This period of time was pure bliss. My nerves rippled with energy, and looking out over the crowd, I saw an infinite pattern of rainbows from which dancing aliens would emerge. The closed-eye visuals were too intense to handle or to describe. I was actually quite lucid during this time. When the set ended, Kay and I went to the restroom. 3.5 to 5 hours. Kay and I found some new seats way in the back where I could sit down. He pulled out a bowl and I took one hit. Things really got moving after that. My mind began to unravel. All of existence began to unravel. And everything that ever happened came forth in one moment. It all made perfect sense. If I really tried, I could tell you where I was. My visions were out of control. Everything became part of a galactic conversation taking place in my brain. My life, freedom, individuality, and identity were held in front of a light for the world to examine. I was engaged in full-on telepathy with pretty much everyone around me. A battle was formed, and I was at the middle of it. Half the world despised me, and I was tortured with their persecutory thoughts. The other half, though, supported my right to exist, my right to be an individual, and to explore the universe in my own unique way. My drug use, sexuality, life story, and spirituality were all exposed and hotly debated amongst the crowd. In effect, I was turned inside out. Of course, this was all way too much to handle, but I wouldn't say I was having a bad trip, although I don't want to understate how difficult such a position can actually be. 5 to 6 hours. By now I was thoroughly confused, and had no idea which side of the conversation I was on anymore. I tried to profess this to Kay, but I was truly unable to communicate in words what was actually occurring. Moreover, the whole exercise seemed pointless, as I already believed I was telepathically communicating with him and everything else in the whole universe. To me, the entire universe was in a state of metamorphosis. Its true nature was beginning to unfold. Everything began to slam together into one cosmic entity whose synthesis had been perfectly calculated eons ago. I had discovered the formula that began this change. I was the catalyst. The phrase, solving the world upside down, continually passed through my brain. To be honest, my thoughts really made no sense. Words and phrases were jumbled and took on new symbolic meanings. I desperately wanted someone to tell me what to do, how to change my life, to be a better person, and to find God. Was I God? Are we all God? Is this new cosmic entity God? I told Kay I had to go and I took off running. In the moment, I assumed he understood what I was talking about, but I found out later that he was actually quite worried. I ran through the crowds. When I arrived at the gates, I actually panicked. What to do? What to do? I passed the first gate and found myself stuck between the security at the first gate and the guy collecting trash a few hundred feet away. I paced back and forth for a while, then bolted past the trash collector. I spent the remainder of the concert wandering the parking lot trying to find someone to help me. I talked to several groups of people, who were all very kind, and tried to figure out what it was that I needed help with. One young woman tried dancing with me and kept asking me if I could smile for her. Another group of people told me that I should be a good person, respect others, and find brotherhood. Despite all this, the cosmic struggles continued, despite everyone's best effort to help. 6 hours. Jay and Kay found me after the show wandering the parking lot. They asked me where I'd been. I just told them I'd discovered the formula to all of existence, and that I needed help figuring out what to do with my life. They tried to get me to explain more, but eventually when I got distraught that they didn't understand, they just gave me a Valium. 6 to 12 hours. I've got to say that the Valium did help me calm down. I reconnected with reality, and the cosmic struggle business subsided over the course of an hour. I was still tripping pretty hard well into the night though, but it was peaceful and enjoyable. I went to bed around 6 AM, and cannot recall whether I slept or not. It is worth noting here that Jay also had an intense experience that in his own words was the hardest he'd ever tripped, but that's his story to tell. Retrospective summary. So in retrospect, it was an irresponsible and foolish decision to take LSD and mescaline in a concert setting. It is clear to me that these drugs have a cumulative effect greater than either alone. This combination is definitely in the big leagues of ego dissolution, introspection, and transformation. It has been 5 months since these events transpired, and I now regard this trip as one of the most important events in my life. Looking back, it is clear to me that the cosmic struggle I experienced was the result of some major dissatisfaction in my life. Central to this was my lack of belief in anything spiritual. In all honesty, I had never even recognized the desire to be spiritual was present inside of me at all. But now I am open to all things spiritual. This is an ongoing project of mine. On another note, I smoked pot twice in the first few months following this experience, and ended up getting paranoid delusions that resembled this trip. In both instances, these delusions ended once the pot wore off. Nevertheless, it has made me think twice about my ability to use psychedelic drugs. For a while, I feared I was becoming schizophrenic, but things have since cooled. I have no desire to trip again any time in the near future. Just thinking about this trip gets me quite agitated, in fact. Nonetheless though, I still feel that this was a worthwhile experience. Something was missing in my life, and I now know what that was. This trip really focused my desire to be a better person, and I feel that drive has not yet faded. Many trips that are perceived as bad are just what happen when one finally confronts the shit that has been bothering them. Yeah, it's frightening and confusing, but if you accept the challenge, it can be incredibly rewarding. Oh, and to the strangers in the parking lot, thank you for your kindness. I bared my soul before you, and you all showed me love, which is a rare event indeed. Deconstructing and Rearranging Reality, a 4MEO PCP trip report by Acoustic, posted to EARBUDS.org January 5th, 2011. This was my first time with this chemical, and I was expecting something like ketamine, but the come-up was incredibly similar to DXM. Thoughts became fragmented, and speech became difficult. The dissociative body load feeling was the strangest I have ever experienced. Not as sedating as ketamine, I remained very mobile, and had much more tactile awareness than with DXM, but I had the most pronounced and obvious feeling that the usually straightforward link between thought and physical movement had a barrier in it, that my body was being moved in some unnatural and awkward way. The psychological aspects of the trip arrived over a minute or two. Very early on into the trip, I had these strange fantasies entering my mind. They seemed to be as apparent and tangible as reality, though I did still have a firm grip on reality itself. Music, though, seemed distant and alien. I completely lost any sense of rhythm and melody. The friends I was with seemed to be highly exaggerated characters, bearing only a basic resemblance to their actual personalities. The situation we were in, just sitting around talking, seemed to be fantastically dramatic and significant. We listened to music, described our thoughts and feelings, smoked pot, watched the relatively subdued OEVs, and everything was actually very pleasant and peaceful. I was playing around with ideas about the room being lit by odd-coloured electric lighting, and the ceiling being only 3 feet above our faces as we lay on the bed looking up at it. And it just seemed so real. I could actually sort of see it and sort of feel it. But only sort of, but still very apparently, it was there. We did a few caps of nitrous oxide, and the first 1 or 2 sent me delirious and then blank for a few seconds. Eventually, after repeated caps though, I tripped. But essentially for me, it was the same as it ever was when mixed with pot. When it was over, I just went right back to the PCP, as if nothing had happened. After probably 90 to 120 minutes at the peak, the physical aspects of it and the visuals began slowly to fade, which was fine, but very annoyingly, the strange, grand, complicated, and involving ideas disappeared all at once, and I was back being myself, firmly grounded in the real world. It was quite a shock, and I felt that I urgently needed to get back there, and further to explore the thoughts I'd skirted around. One of the people who'd planned a trip with us that night wasn't feeling well enough, so there was another dose going spare. Nobody else wanted to do it, so I did. I sat talking, still under the effects, and the come-up this time was much less obvious, although, looking back, much more dramatic. At the time, it was less obvious because the more intense the psychological effects became, the less able I became to focus on exactly what was happening. This is very difficult to explain. I suppose when I'm in a normal mental state, I can think about a few things at once, because some thoughts are clear and focused in my mind, and others sort of float around and make connections with others, but I don't have to put any effort into keeping them hanging around until I need them. I completely lost my ability to do any of this. I could only direct the whole of my attention to one specific thought at a time. My friend would ask me what he considered to be a straightforward question, and I'd have to think about every minuscule implication of what he'd said, what my opinion was on each of them, usually getting him to repeat the question after each stage of logic, because I'd had to concentrate so hard on the tiny part of it. I'd actually forgotten why I was thinking about it. Being asked a question like, "Do you want to put a different record on?" And after minutes and minutes of staring silently into space and internally battling with the question, I finally answered, okay. Eventually, the single focused thoughts I was having became so clear and so all-encompassing that I could see them played out before my eyes, and feel them in deep parts of my brain, the way you feel a distant memory or an inclination, rather than just thinking about it intellectually. Gradually, I got the ability to have more than one idea at once, but each of them experienced in this way through senses and from multiple perspectives at once. I got double vision, which gradually split into 4, and eventually got so complicated I couldn't focus on anything, and my vision effectively was a constantly changing, swirling mess. My vision was completely useless. Eventually, open-eye visual style visuals started creeping over the top of the incomprehensible mess of what I was seeing. I saw a clay block. I saw it in the past and the future at the same time. It existed in multiple spaces at once, but not a number of spaces next to each other. It existed in the same space, but at different moments in time. This is actually impossible to explain, I think, but I saw it in 4 dimensions of sorts. Up, down, left, right, forward, backwards, and past, present, future. It was the furthest thing from reality as I usually understand it that I have ever experienced in my life. I ended up lying in the bath, without water in, and looking out over onto the rim into my small bathroom. It stretched out for hundreds of meters, glittering with glass and blue jewels, and I could not possibly comprehend where I was or what the house I was in might look like outside the bathroom door. I kept getting my friend to tell me that we were in my house, to list the names of the people who were in the house, which room they were in, and what they were doing. I knew the names of the people were familiar, and words like bedroom and watching TV and sleeping. I knew what they meant, but they were only ever as real to me as the strange and now obviously fictional things that popped in and out of existence constantly. This extreme disconnection from reality was scary, but I knew really that it posed no real threat to me, because the house was very quiet and everyone else seemed to be in total control, and no one was going anywhere. The thought, this will all end at some point and things will go back to normal, never actually occurred to me like it does on psychedelics, and even on DXM and ketamine. I forced myself to think it at times, but I never believed it. In this moment, my sense of time had actually disappeared. I couldn't imagine ever not being on the drug. I couldn't imagine that it would never end. This seemed to crop up in my train of thoughts as a problem, but never a big one, until eventually my thoughts became so fast and frenzied that I was thinking so many things at once. The sheer quantity and speed of my thoughts was more than my sober mind could ever possibly have processed. I became convinced that this would have some permanent effect on me, and that I would never be the same person again. I never got this thought out of my mind, but managed to ignore it at the peak. During the long come down though, it kept coming back to haunt me, when my thoughts became more ordered and less chaotic, but still very strange and inexplicable to the people around me. It seemed more and more pressing that the longer I went without remembering quite what normality was, the less of a chance there was I would ever get it back. I had an idea of what ego death was, but essentially and simply put, it's forgetting who you are and the dissociation of yourself from all of your memories and experiences that normally go towards defining your identity. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep after about 8 hours, 6 hours or so after the second dose. I woke up with zero afterglow and zero hangover. Although there are a lot of thoughts that I actually believe are incomprehensible to a sober mind, that there is no chance of me properly recalling. I remembered the moments I had those thoughts and aspects of what was happening and what I did. But I remembered a huge amount of the trip, and understood a huge amount of the thoughts that I had for the very first time that night. Much more so than with DXM. With DXM, I'm shocked every time I do it at the huge quantity of ideas that are so obvious and memorable while high, but that I'd completely forgotten about, or been perplexed or bored by if I'd remembered them while sober. 4-MeO PCP was much, much less like that. There's so much more I experienced and thought. I've chosen the bits I think best express what it was like, but it's so much more incredibly complicated and strange and exciting than I could ever write down, even if I did write a million words. This is the most intense and immersive experience that I've ever had with substances, more so than acid, DPT, ketamine. I think at some point soon, I'm going to try a 250 to 300mg dose, since I'll be less overwhelmed and more comfortable, and hopefully, I'll be able to find out more about this very strange substance. Hallucinosexual, a 2CB, meclobamide, hydrogen, vinpocetine, and codeine trip report by Jonas. Posted to EARBUDS.org March 24th, 2001. I recently had the opportunity to join in on an excursion into the vast hyperspatial realms of my unconsciousness. Even though I knew that the infinite vistas of the human psyche are impossible to convert into a linear communication media, I will do my best to bring back and share some of the memories from our journey. To make things somewhat easier to grasp, I'd first like to mention the catalyst that made this joyful excursion possible. At 9 o'clock, I ingested 80mg of meclobamide, or Rixmanirix, to inhibit the, on some special occasions, annoying and intricate enzymes usually referred to as MAOA. The next hour, I spent reading a neutral book, Novel with Cocaine by M. Egiev, just to kill time and distract from the strong anticipation I felt. At 10 PM, the MAOs seemed to be quite preoccupied, and for some strange reason, even content, with the alien substrate I introduced to them. This inevitably resulted in an urge to ingest an exogenous neurotransmitter, whose primary site of action is the postsynaptic 5-HT2 neurons. Yes, my enzymes are very eloquent and pharmacologically inclined. After some consideration, I decided to ingest 20mg of 4-bromo-2,5-dimethoxyphenylethylamine, often acronymized as 2CB. This was not done without obstacles though. I just couldn't figure which of the small white pills in the jar was 2CB. There were two different kinds, ubulawu, 2CB, and vinpocetine. So, I ended up taking 4 of each to be on the safe side. The effects came on smoothly within an hour or so, and I climbed, maybe dragged is probably more apt in this case, until I reached the peak at about 11:30 PM. The territory was known from previous attempts to climb Mount Nexus, but this time I was almost blinded by the sharp and colourful landscape though. I took a look in the mirror and noticed that I had very dilated pupils. Sort of strange, don't you think? The mental climate was warm and loaded with empathy and erotic feelings, again reminding me of previous encounters with this state of mind, especially those in company with good friends. The imagery, or should I say landscape, consisted of dancing, luminous patterns, which were following what seemed to be completely logical structures, but lacking any deeper meaning as far as I could interpret it. The intent of this trip wasn't to watch the dancing colours, mind you, even though I must admit that it was appealing to do so in the moment, but rather it was to resolve some addiction problems that I've been facing lately. I wanted to experience the ever-changing oneness of the whole universe, which usually puts me on a new path, leading to a somewhat more creative and purposeful behaviour. Note the paradoxical nature of purposeful. If this wasn't possible, it seems to me that this state is hard to reach. I was prepared to do some work within myself's boundaries and deconstruct my archetypical combination, reassembling it in a way to make my life easier, instead of anaesthetise me every day to make me able to cope with the daily life. I know this sounds pretentious, but it really was my ambition to solve this problem. At 1 AM, I realised that I was not going to reach any plateau where I could work on my problems, even though, judging from the CEVs and OEVs, this trip was actually intense. I decided to introduce some other foreign substances to my body. 3 milligrams of ergoloid mesylate, hydrogen, another one of Hoffman's great discoveries, and 70 milligrams of codeine phosphate, which was ingested with great joy. Shortly after this, I mixed 350 milligrams of Afghani hashish, Hindu Kush grade A+, with some tobacco and smoked it in a jubang, steamroller, glycol-cooled glass pipe, to introduce complete weirdness, TM, to the trip. I didn't feel a thing from the hashish, so I loaded my pipe once again with another 350 milligrams and inhaled almost all of it. Note that I don't smoke pot in my ordinary state of consciousness, as it makes me feel more sick than high, but it does seem to synergise remarkably well with 2CB, leaving no sign of sickness and intensifies probably a better word, the effects of the bees extremely. Try this if you haven't. Cannabis also makes me very sexually excited at about 25% of the times that I use it, and this was one of those occasions. Now, this is where the complete weirdness began. To even try to put this in words seems to be impossible. The following hours, or was it years, of the trip, incorporated encounters with elves, alien abduction, fold cycling, etc. I will not go into detail of most of these events, but merely extract some of the perceptions that struck me as significant. So far, I haven't been able to digest this trip. I'm still semi-tripping. The events didn't appear in the linear fashion that I might give the impression of. They occurred in a more of a hyperspatial alpha helix structure kind of way, whatever that means. And I went back from the window where I'd been smoking to my bed and turned on the TV. I seldom watch it while being sober, and yes, I know it's a bad thing to combine drugs. I didn't feel anything from the cannabis so far, but after what I think was a few minutes, I noticed that I began to project my own psychological construction on the people on the TV, making them some sort of 3D archetypical projection cloth. This is actually only part of the truth, as I thought I actually was a cameraman, being in the studio, and this was a manifestation of complete weirdness and everything that accompanies it. I decided that this was enough, so I switched off the TV, and as I was laying there on my back, feelings of acute sexual desire almost overwhelmed me. But as I was quite incapacitated from the combination of drugs, I wasn't able to do something about it. When I've been in this position before, I've always been in the company of someone with reciprocal thoughts, and things have been sorted out in quite a natural way. This time though, I was all alone, and the only way to get relief was to do some kind of psychological masturbation. I was reminded of someone who once told me that monks redirected their sexual energy into spiritual fuel to enhance the search for the ultimate reality. So, I began concentrating on my breath, and when it became stable, I directed my attention to my lower abdomen. As I let my concentration focus on the sexual energy, I split up into 2 different entities, one being Jonas, as I currently know him, locked up in a static percept but not interact mode though, and the other one being a magnified sperm-looking kind of entity, climbing up the other entity's, Jonas's, spine. The journey up Jonas's spine was very colourful and intricate. I, the sperm, was flowing through a tunnel of multicoloured waveforms which sometimes took the shape and gave the impression of living entities. This tunnel did not just affect my, the sperm's, sight, but including all my perception organs. I heard bells, strings and flutes, nature sounds, birds, waves, winds, etc., and smelled a very diverse mix of smells, mostly fruity scents from what I recall, but this might be due to some of the PEA synth, implicit metaprogramming. What I found to be the most interesting part of this perceptional shower was the tactile sensation, which felt like I was swimming through a dense forest of mucous membranes. The obvious and immediate interpretation of this was that I was in search for an ovum. As I proceeded towards the head, the perceptional sensations became more intense, and when I finally reached the head, my sexual energy, the sperm, merged with the brain, creating a solid harmony within my conscious frame which resulted in a completely new entity. The entity that was created after the merge had no perceptible body, and the physical organism that was formerly known as Jonas had ceased to exist, and there was no hint of input from the physical world. A whole new sphere of existence appeared, containing elf-like beings, flowing around in, once again, complete logical structures, communicating in a way that from a normal state of consciousness could be interpreted as telepathically. The actual communication media was perceptible, but it is impossible to describe. To be honest, I'm not too fond of these critters floating around trying to make me laugh. Their communication media seems to me as some sort of psychological tickling. It's my firm belief that they are ego productions that distract one from realizing one's true self. They can of course give some useful information about your, and the emotional and value-loaded environment, current archetypical configuration, but they are a brick in the wall that stops you from seeing, or being, your constantly evolving and expanding self. I interacted with the elves for a while before I decided to break through this layer of distraction, which I did by focusing on nothing, shikantaza. As my concentration increased, the duality between subject and object started to retreat. There was this short moment of total emptiness, and then I suddenly felt very alone. This loneliness was unbearable, and before I knew it I split up, or actually making a 3D shadow of myself, the classic fold, which became a beautiful spherical construction, attracting me by its female characteristics. I realised that this was a big mistake, as I now was two autonomous halves. I desperately began chasing her as I wanted to complete myself again. This hide-and-seek game was a very funny occupation, but at the same time it became more and more frustrating. I grasped for her, but she constantly slipped through my fingers with her dynamic, slippery and ergonomically correct appearance, multiplying herself all the time. Things began to get really out of hand, and I figured that as I actually was both of these separate entities at once, I must have the ability to keep a look on both of them. Now, it seemed as if I was perceptionally zoomed out a layer, and I could perceive the constant expansion and multiplying of myself. This was a totally schizophrenic state, as there was this ever-increasing amount of entities at the same as I knew that I was one. This aspect of the one was just functioning as a carrier wave. Time? I then could zoom in and out through a seemingly infinite number of layers, folds, dimensions, whatever, being different parts of the hide-and-seek game. Note that the expansion was not constant in the sense that it was a uniform expansion. Different aspects of the oneness had separate multiplication times in all directions. Once in a while, separate manifestations catched up with the continuous expansion. They would merge and then go back into the emptiness, the space before the loneliness, instead of multiplying itself. The catching up was done by the former oneness that so badly wanted to become one again. The merging activity was done on separate planes and locations at the same time, but following a seemingly irregular pattern, finally. The merging had different half-lives depending on the construction, and the ability, harmonic ratio of shadow, expansion, or non-shadow, static principles within the entity, of the aspect. As my attention became more and more affected by the actions of the deconstruction work, the visual imagery became more death and destruction oriented, which resulted in one of these death feedback loops so familiar from previous bad trips. I cycled in the feedback loop for a while before I realised I didn't care if I was going to die or not. The death layer had been resolved during an earlier period of my life, which I think I've mentioned before. But anyway, as I broke through this layer, once again employing shikantaza, things suddenly became normal, and I returned to my body. I thought for a while that the trip was over, and it was all just very calm and quiet around me. I could see the dark contours of the interior of my room. I thought this was very strange, but as the effect of the 2CB always seems to end quite abruptly, it made me a bit insecure. Suddenly, my room was lit up by a sharp monochrome light that seemed to have the correct wavelength and intensity, or energy, to excite every atom within my body, making me radiate light at the same wavelength until I became one with the light and I was suddenly abducted or teleported. This experience was just as real as events in real life, but I can't see how it's really relevant to my life, and I think it was just another manifestation of the ego, Maya, Maikyo, etc., to distract me from myself, so we'll not go into detail. An interesting thing though, at this point, my visual imagery changed form completely, from a fast-flowing motion into a static though colourful and illusory perennial 3D landscape. While being in this 3D landscape, I once again was overwhelmed by strong sexual feelings. In fact, not just feelings, but also sexual perceptions. But not perceptions of a human nature. They were just sexual and had nothing to do with humans. Maybe it's just me who has become hallucinosexual. I must say that I was perplexed in this state, because I was not sure if I actually was walking around the house where I live, walking in another world. At this time I was a bit insecure whether I died or not in that death feedback loop I mentioned, or if it was just a hallucination altogether. If you've ever had a real stiff dose of THC, you probably know how this feels. I was stuck in this wonderful and seemingly infinite but static world for the rest of the trip. It was very pleasant, but I wanted to break on through to the next stage. But alas, I was exhausted and was unable to concentrate. I think I actually went to sleep directly from this state, in fact. Well, sorry for the abrupt ending, but I've got a train to catch. The Swish of the Shashapa, an ayahuasca trip report by Dylan, posted to EARBUDS.org March 5th, 2008.
What we need now are explorers. We need many diaries of many explorers, so we can begin to get a feel for the territory.
Terence McKenna. The search for our spiritual selves is indeed a dangerous endeavour. It is a truly horrifying sight when the shells we occupy during our daily lives are ripped away, if only partially, and we are able to catch fleeting glimpses into a space that is truly indescribable. I speak of scopes and terrains of such immensity and power that our fragile minds are blown away by the sheer force of their existence, their aliveness, and perhaps most disturbing, their indifference. Somewhere within this awesome celestial synchrony of life, we each exist, every one of us, participating in some unknown way. Each act, every step, infused completely with volition, with purpose. In the end, I'll bet, the only thing that makes sense is to find humour in the silliness of our lives, and to laugh at our tenacious efforts to find some meaning and purpose in a place where there is no single truth, in a place where the same leaf can fall off the same tree twice. My experience of ayahuasca took place 4 hours upriver from the jungle city of Iquitos, located in the heart of the Peruvian Amazon. I'd read very little about the plant, but I'd recently read about similar plants and the profound effects created when utilised in the right places, with a proper guide. Ayahuasca is a vine found in the upper Amazon rainforest, in which an extract is taken and mixed with several other local plants to make a drink. It has been used in spiritual rituals among shamanic tribes dating back millennia. I will not go into great detail about the uses of the plant, as all I really want to do is provide an account of my experience partaking in this ritual. What I will say though, however, is that I did not come prepared, as I had not undertaken the proper diet and other body cleansing responsibilities that are usually required before ingesting this plant. The guide at the jungle lodge I was staying at first tried to dissuade me from the experience entirely. It took me 2 days to assure him that I was not simply looking for a new drug experience, and although I had no previous knowledge of the plant, I was approaching the situation with the humbleness, respect, and fear that it deserved. Later in the day, he came and told me that he had spoken to a shaman from a local village, and the ceremony would be performed with me and him alone, beginning at 10 that night. I was disappointed at my reaction, which was rather mild at the time. This is something that I had been coveting for a long time. A pagan ritual with a real shaman involving a hallucinogenic drug propelling me into unknown realms. I remained rather detached the remainder of the day, although I did develop a knot in my stomach that would stay with me for another 5 days. In truth, I was terrified, and a large part of me really wanted to back out. My reaction surprised me as I began to realise how much I had truly come to believe in the legitimacy of what I was going to undertake. Not a few months ago, I would have called myself an atheist. As the time drew near, I realised that the elation and transcendence I had hoped for would not be something easily come by, and that nothing worth having ever comes easy, nor should it. Indeed, this theme would resurface with a pitiless vengeance later that night. I met up with Don Jorge about an hour before the ceremony. He was quiet and very non-assuming. I was not disappointed, as he appeared to have the inner calm and knowing that I fantasized about. There was a ferocity to him, in fact, that I would discover later, but nothing dangerous or sinister. I'd actually come to trust him implicitly. I waited nervously while he prepared the room, a small bungalow at the far end of the lodge. I'd earlier opted out of performing the ceremony at his village given there was no mosquito net, and I would be left exposed and unable to defend myself throughout the night. The lodge guide, Moses, instructed me on certain aspects of the ritual I was to perform. He spoke about his experiences, and continuously asserted that I must concentrate. This was unusual to me, since in my previous psychedelic experiences, it's only when I lost my concentration that the visuals and insights flowed more freely. Focusing too hard on these anomalies would shift me back toward a more normal perspective, and they would laughingly fade into the fog form from when they came. I told him that I was scared. Good, fear is important, I think. You must come to Mother Ayahuasca with respect. Tell yourself that you are going to have a good trip, and perhaps you even will. I silently followed Don Jorge and Moses down a wooden walkway to the farthest corner of the lodge. Other lodge residents, whom I had earlier boasted about my decision, wished me luck, along with several villagers who were hired to drive the boats and maintain the lodge. They wore these mischievous smiles as I passed. I took them as good signs I was about to experience something profound though, and painful, and completely mysterious. They knew that I really had no idea what I was about to experience. I entered the room, took my shoes off, and sat on a mat against the wall. Don Jorge sat about 3 feet in front of me to the right. All the candles were extinguished, except for one located between us. I had a bottle of water, some coca leaves to chew, and a vomit bucket. Moses told me he would be in and out to check on my progress. Don Jorge began to chant and shake a shashapa rattle, a small branch of dried out leaves used as a spirit catcher. I shivered as he began to call up the spirits of ayahuasca. His song was truly beautiful. I felt myself falling into a trance-like state as I followed its hypnotic rhythms. It followed a specific pattern, in which we would finish a verse, drop an octave, and repeat the cadence, then raise 2 octaves, and then finish with the original. The swish-swish of the shashapa rattle blended perfectly with his song. Suddenly he blew out the candle and lit a pipe, filled with a very, very pungent tobacco. He blew 3 times into a bottle containing the ayahuasca, then leaned over and blew smoke over my body. All of this done in perfect unison with the rhythm of this song. He poured me a glass. "Salute, Don Jorge." No thinking now. no backing out. I drank the foul-tasting liquid and fought very hard to keep it down. Salute, Dylan. Don Jorge tipped back the bottle and drank quite a bit more than he gave me. He leaned in close and began to hit the pipe in a rapid succession, each outward breath coating me in the cleansing smoke. He gave it to me and motioned for me to do the same. I finally sat back and allowed myself to become enraptured by his song. I had about an hour before the fireworks would begin. As I relate my experience to you here, I think it's quite important to note that not all of what I saw and felt was actually available to me at the time. There was way too much to process and encode into memory. And as I've reflected on the experience over the past month, new memories have resurfaced from the time fog. I have slowly been incorporating them into a somewhat coherent flow of events now that I can make more sense of. With that said, everything I'm now about to say is deceiving. It has been dumbed down into a scope that is understandable and workable by my small mind. The worlds in which I entered exist at a point beyond human understanding. I had no concept for and lacked the cognitive capacity to conceptualize the beings that existed in that place. Without a guide, I would imagine the assault of the visions would be even more jumbled, incoherent, and domineering. He had a guiding presence that would draw me away from visions too intense and dark for me to handle in my untrained and undisciplined state. Words are utterly incapable of describing my glimpse into a realm where emotions, thoughts, sound, sight, smell, and tactile sensations lost their distinctive edges, where egos dissolve and merge with the external, where I was a willing and knowing participant in the divine substance that exists inside and out of everything. A place, all-encompassing and saturated, completely saturated, with volition and life. The first hour was all waiting though. I sat against the wall immersed in an oppressive darkness listening to Don Jorge sing. His song would change from whistles to a series of blowing noises, back to a mixture of Spanish and the native tongue of Quechua. I began to doubt myself and my right to even be there. I felt fraudulent sitting next to Don Jorge, an unworthy, privileged, condescending foreigner, a descent of the conquering West who mercilessly plagued and nearly eradicated hundreds of such cultures. I thought that Don Jorge should be disgusted with me. He periodically leaned forward to blow smoke on my head, a gesture to cleanse and prepare me for the onslaught of the visions. I became very nervous that I had not yet vomited and was not feeling the effects of the vine. Don Jorge offered me a second glass. Salute, Don Jorge. Salute, Dylan. I suddenly became aware that I was vomiting, a natural part of the process, mind you, known as purging. By degrees, I realised that I was taking turns with two figures sitting on either side of me. We each would purge in turn, and as it progressed, I felt an intimate bond begin to form between us. I actually rather liked them. I was able to anticipate each surge of energy produced before each purge, as if different parts of me were connected to the two figures. I remember feeling that this initial cleansing was necessary before I could begin. Suddenly, I remembered that it was only Don Jorge and I in the room. The faces of my two comrades materialized. My two best friends sat facing me, Mike and Corey. Their faces were clear and more real than it is possible to conjure up in normal imagination. Corey was quite the quintessential Corey, the essence of Coryness. Every nuance, every line on his face and movement of his body conveyed meaning. Vivid and alive and so very powerful. We actually began to communicate without words, conversing beyond language, straight to the center of knowing. I knew without a doubt what it conveyed. Our relationship presented itself as a singular feeling. It was right. I watched as all the bullshit our minds created melt away, actually melt away, mind you, visually and viscerally. The focal point or essence of the meaning of our connection emerged amidst melting colours. He leaned forward and blew smoke in my face, and I was overwhelmed by the immensity of it all. I had to physically avert my gaze before I would be consumed. Then I look at Mike. A look of farewell. He abruptly stood up and walked toward the door. He turned to look at me over his right shoulder. As our paths parted, His eyes contained in that very moment the strife and pain and wonder in his life, while simultaneously expressing our relationship with all its struggles and triumphs. I purged, and the pain was excruciating. It took precedence over the visions. I felt regret and lost time, and faded into darkness and agony. Time was no factor, yet much passed before I regained a measure of control. I distantly, so very distantly, heard the soft, soothing rattle of the shashapa. I followed the sound, and felt my spirit moving as if in a windless void, pulled forward by a force unknown. I was compelled to fight through a desire to faint. The sound turned to a pressure on my abdomen. I cut my stomach with my hands to keep the sound close. Each rattle became a colour, and each colour became more brilliant as I drew closer and closer to the source. Suddenly in that moment I became aware of Don Jorge's song, a glorious symphony of light and hope. I wept without tears at the majesty of the sound, and my mind cleared. Following which, I opened my eyes. The room itself was black, yet superimposed on the darkness was what appeared to be an energy grid, a luminescent one, and ever-changing yet constant. It ran through everything in the room, connecting everything in some immeasurable way. I sat for a bit in the colours, enjoying the temporary respite from the intensity of the ayahuasca spirit. If I allowed myself to focus on any one aspect of the energy grid, I would feel it begin to pull me in. I resisted by refocusing my attention on Don Jorge. Each new discovery seemed to happen suddenly without warning. All at once I noticed the sounds of the jungle. I could distinguish specific individualized sounds among the chorus of the jungle life. I honestly could have spent the rest of my life lost in the intricacies and combinations of songs and languages of that beautiful moment. Each sound was its own language, with its own purpose and direction. Each sound had its own corresponding colour and feeling as well. Everything merged and coalesced into an undifferentiated dance of feeling and expression infinitely beyond my ability to grasp. I did know, however, that what I was witnessing was a grand language, with truth upon truth, wrapped and tangled and connected. It was actually aware of me. It was fucking aware of me. A shudder ran through my body. I raised my hands in a defensive posture in an attempt to force back a growing pressure. They shook and danced along with the language of the jungle. A chanting began far off to my right. A soft, almost druid-like sound that grew louder and louder in my awareness. It was a message for me. A singular, discernible, distinct message that I could understand. We conversed, and I was lifted up with it. My mind expanded and was able to hold multiple concepts and chains of dialogue at once. This was a place remembered, re-experienced from some deep recess in my mind. I was profoundly aware that I had been here before. Again, the intensity of it all grounded me. I realised that the sound I was conversing with were actually frogs. I crashed from the treetops and found myself again purging, frightened and in agony. Don Jorge loomed over me, sucking and draining off the excessive energy, ingesting it himself. He lit the pipe and his eyes glowed orange in the darkness, illuminated and floating in the free air. He passed it to me, and I smoked, immediately purging again. To be honest with you, the next few hours are a blur, and I'm sure the lessons ayahuasca attempted to teach me were too much for me to handle. I mercifully blanked out much of it. People I knew passed before my eyes, floating before me. Each person in turn changed and twisted into a feminine-like deity, facing me, examining me in scrutinous detail. Her eyes were fantastic. She was even talking with me, yet I was refusing to engage her. Her eyes held messages that I could not understand. I quickly learned to push the image away before it pulled me down into another lesson. Yet again and again she came, each time in the form of a person in my life. I resolutely pushed her away. How much I must have missed out on by doing this. I began to beg whoever for the visions to just end. I was drenched in sweat, and my stomach and chest were sore from vomiting. Ayahuasca would not let me go. I felt true despair for the first time in my life. And yet, time passed, I suppose, in which I actually recall much agony. I remember realizing that I had to pass through a doorway located just behind my left shoulder before I would be let out. The moment I decided to go, Don Jorge changed his song. It became angry and menacing. A spirit hand shoved me backwards into a silent darkness. It was in that moment I knew I was actually being given a gift. A presence lingered, pressuring me in the stomach and chest. I was honestly nothing compared to it, this essence of blackness. But in that moment I lost all fear and opened myself, and was shown death. That was my gift. I felt what death was like, or at least the moment before death. I was somber and detached, yet I felt it with a visceralness that I will not experience again until the very moment that I do die. It was transcendent and glorious. It was the ultimate destroyer, soul-crushing, and the consumer of awareness. I loved and loathed it. I thought of it as the ultimate expression of the conflicting forces that make up life and death, without which there could be no existence. It was the source of all things, but only a small part. It played out its role indifferently. It would hear no bargaining. And together we sat for an infinite moment, and I was content without fear. Don Jorge appeared. I was within my own boundaries again now. He'd completed a closing song, running his hands down my head and over my back and chest. I felt the ceremony ending and my everyday ego beginning to return. Moses came back in, who helped me get up and gather my stuff. He conversed with Don Jorge, who silently departed without even a glance. I was drunk and disoriented in that moment. Moses led me back to my room and I felt this warm sensation on the back of my right calf. Eventually I looked down and saw a large tree frog resting on my leg. He jumped to the ledge right in front of me, and my eyes were drawn to him, and for a moment I just stood and stared. Moses chuckled and whispered in my ear, "Jorge says that your spirit animal is the frog." I tried to speak, but I could not form words. And yet again, in that moment, I purged. Mind-shattering. A Salvia Divinorum trip report by Andreas, posted to EARBUDS.org February 9th, 2007. I've always been fascinated by psychoactive drugs and have experience with a wide variety of them. Lately, my attention has been drawn to Salvia Divinorum. I've done my research on this plant and have read through a great number of experience reports online. After nearly a year of toying with the idea, I finally decided that the time was right for a direct experience. I ordered 1 gram of regular strength enhanced leaf from what I concluded was probably the most reputable source available on the internet. My order arrived promptly. Because it was still early in the week, I decided to wait until the long Labor Day weekend before doing any experimenting. Being aware of the importance of set and setting in any psychedelic experience, I was conscious of having been rather stressed out for the last couple of weeks. Work had been unusually busy. At home, I was engaged in several significant repairs to my old house. All of this in conjunction with trying to keep up with my normal routines was running me ragged. So Saturday finally rolled around. I was still feeling run down and could barely get off the couch until evening approached. I took another shower, drank some fruit juice and felt invigorated, ready to enjoy my evening. I drove downtown, bought a glass pipe at the local head shop, picked up a pizza and headed back home. Since I wasn't sure how I'd feel after my upcoming salvia experience, I first made sure to take care of any evening chores before settling in. After everything had been taken care of and a couple of slices of pizza, I was feeling calm, confident, and ready for whatever awaited me. Without any hesitation, I began my ritual. I got on my knees and said a prayer to my God. I asked for continuing guidance and to be granted knowledge and wisdom from my experience. It seemed important to thus reaffirm the purity of my intent. I completed my preparation by lighting a sage incense bundle and wafting the smoke around the living room. Finally, I settled back into the couch and began to prepare the leaf. Earlier in the day, I had reread the Salvia Divinorum FAQ and knew that a sitter was strongly recommended, especially for an inexperienced user. I had made the decision to forgo this precaution though. This was mainly because I no longer run in circles where such experimentation is condoned. So, I guess I've become somewhat of a lone wolf in these endeavours. In any case, I decided that my dog would be a sufficient sitter, friendly, familiar, and well-grounded. As I will relate further on, this actually turned out to be a mistake. As I prepared the pipe, I reflected on my expectations. Admittedly, I was going into this experience a complete skeptic. The wide range of experience reports I had read caused me to entertain the possibility that salvia might not be psychoactive at all, that instead, the effects might be the result of some kind of bizarre placebo effect, or at best, an enhanced head rush caused by hyperventilating the smoke. On the other hand, there were far too many compelling reports of amazing encounters with this plant for me to dismiss its potential effects outright. In other words, I was prepared for failure, yet at the same time ready for success. Most of my doubts had been centered on the number of reports describing little to no effect, or those having to make several attempts to achieve a modest breakthrough experience. But I can state unequivocally that nothing could have prepared me for what was to come next. I fully expected having to take several hits to achieve any results, so I folded up 3 pieces of stiff paper. Into each crease I poured a good hit of each leaf. By the way, I have not smoked marijuana in over 12 years, so I wasn't sure how my lungs would react to the smoke. I took one of the papers and poured it into the bowl of my pipe. I noted the time at 8:32 PM. I picked up and lit my lighter, put the pipe to my lips, and inhaled deeply. I did a lung check after pulling in about 3/4 of the bowl. It actually felt quite smooth. I reapplied the lighter, sucked in the rest, and held it. Okay. My inner voice told me to put the pipe and lighter on the table now. As my hands moved towards the table, it seemed I could no longer feel them. Then I noticed what I can only describe as a slight hiccup in my visual field. At that point, I was no longer certain that I had succeeded in placing my tools back on the coffee table. My last conscious memory was of leaning back into the couch. I felt a vague sensation of exhaling smoke. Before my head hit the cushion, I was gone. And I mean gone. There are no words to adequately describe what followed, to be honest. The only way I can even begin to describe it is that I had the sense of being catapulted head over heels through some kind of warp in space or time. I became aware of strange spiral arches that looked a lot like the double helix DNA strands. The coils seemed to be composed of colourful moving trains and buses. I heard somebody's voice. I cannot recollect now what it said though. But there was a presence of my mother. Had I become her? Because it also felt as though I was no longer me. All I can say with any real certainty is that I had completely lost any sense of myself in ordinary reality. I was completely disconnected from any physical body and had travelled to God knows where. Despite the overpowering sense that I had travelled backward in time, my first conscious thought was an astonished, "Holy shit, I've been blown into next Tuesday." This absurd phrase seemed to repeat itself over and over. I became dimly conscious of my surroundings after what seemed a few moments later, and found myself about 10 feet away from the couch in the hallway. Whether I was standing or lying on the floor, I cannot tell, but I began to feel frightened and confused. The panicked thought that I might not ever return flitted through my mind. This was what madness must feel like. When I started to come back, the realization that the salvia had actually worked began to dawn on me. I had to remind myself that the effects were supposed to pass quickly. It was then that I found myself facing my kitchen. The walls and floor were skewed at unnatural angles. All I could do was exclaim out loud, "My God, there it is! There's my kitchen!" The realization was both astonishing and a profound relief. Here was a reality I could understand. I remember turning around and seeing my dog still lying on the floor, and I shouted a similar exclamation. "Oh my God, there's my dog!" This turning back and forth between the kitchen and the dog seemed to oscillate back and forth several times. Between each turn, I was zapped back into Salvia land and completely lost touch with whom or where I was. It was during one of those oscillations that I remembered that I had been hitting on a pipe. I became anxious that a still burning coal might have spilled out of the pipe and caught something on fire. This anxiety was amplified when I realised that if that were the case, I was in no shape to take any action to put out the fire. The thought of having to call the fire department under these circumstances shot into my brain. It seemed so absurd that I began to laugh hysterically. Meanwhile, each period of oscillation into normal reality began to last longer than the associated period into Salvia reality. I managed to grope my way back to the coffee table through a visual field still consisting of impossible angles. To my relief, I saw that the pipe was indeed still on the table and that nothing seemed to have spilled out and caught fire. That is when the episode of the dog occurred. Apparently, my actions had aroused him into a playful mood, and he started to jump up on me. I lost it again, and when I came back, we were on the floor wrestling with each other, chasing each other in an infinite circle. At some point I began to fear that I was losing control over my dog. I just wanted it to stop. I finally managed to command him to go lay down. The oscillations were beginning to subside and I lay back on the couch. When I was finally able to look at and comprehend the clock, I saw that less than 15 minutes had elapsed. The time was now 8:45 PM. Now I was in a euphoric state. I found myself laughing in utter disbelief at what had just transpired. That can't have been real, I would think. Then I'd laugh again when I realised it had been all too real. The next 10 minutes or so just zipped on by. Close to 9 PM, I attempted to take notes on everything that had happened so far. That's when my dog started to freak me out again. He was cowering and barking at something in the middle of the living room. I've not seen him act timid towards people, so his behaviour was extremely baffling. This is where I began to entertain some paranoid thoughts. Maybe my shouting during the trip had been heard by people outside and they were skulking about trying to look in. I even considered the possibility that I was hallucinating the whole thing. But I was together enough at this point to check the basement and look outside. Thankfully, I found nothing out of the ordinary, and my dog finally calmed down. I didn't like the creepy feeling this caused, though. I finished my notes and reclined back on the couch trying to relax, recover, and further collect my thoughts. I noted that it was already 9:30 PM. Where had the last half hour gone? I was back at baseline with no ill effects. After watching TV for a while, I began to feel drowsy, but falling asleep was no problem. I recall vivid and strange dreams near morning, but I guess that is ordinary for me, and I cannot attribute it to any Salvia after effects. On Siebert's Salvia scale, this was definitely a level 5 immaterial experience. It was overwhelming for a first time. I did not expect a single hit of regular strength enhanced leaf to produce such a transformation. After all this is said and done, I am no longer a skeptic. Salvia Divinorum is for real. Its effects are powerful and profound. It is unlike anything I've ever done. I do believe that it might belong in a class of its own. Unlike mushrooms or LSD, no cosmic knowledge was revealed to me, nor did I transcend language or ego. There were no stages or levels to go through either. However, I did learn respect for the plant. It confronted me with one of my weak points. That is, my inability to completely let go. Last night, the goddess was dominant. I would have gained more from this experience had I not had to worry about fire. A sitter might have alleviated this concern. Also, next time there will be no dog present. That was an unnecessary and unfortunate distraction. And I'm also going to lessen the dose. I feel like I'm sort of looking forward to my next encounter. Face of a Goddess. A Salvia Divinorum at 20x and 60x trip report by Jeebus Black. Posted to EARBUDS.org April 24th, 2012. During the early hours of December 14th, 2007, I went on 2 trips into Salvia space by way of 2 different extracts. The first being 20x, the second a much more powerful force of 60x that I hadn't experienced before. The plan, carried out, was to have a brief stint into Salvia space with 20x, testing the waters so to speak, and within the hour of come down, take a trip with 60x. My testing the waters with 20x was a nice trip, starting by me taking a nice large drag from the bong, lighting the salvia with flame most of the time until all I saw left was fine grey ash, then holding and exhaling after about 20 to 30 seconds, quickly putting the bong and lighter down, and laying back. I left my eyes open for much of the trip, and not having taken enough to truly encompass my senses, was awarded only a brief stint into the rotating kaleidoscopic image of faces continuously opening their mouths beyond the normal limits, exposing a black abyss beyond. From my perspective, the faces were quite enormous, and towards the end of the trip, the primary visuals of the trip formed into the ceiling fan of the room, the fan blades being the abyssal opening mouths, the golden arms attaching to the fan motor emerging from what was white teeth, the centre being the kaleidoscopic collage of faces. I was slowly eased out of the trip. Audio hallucination consisted of the background repeated statement, "I can't find the password," over and over again, in the muffled speech pattern of a male. Looking over to my sitter, I saw him smirk just slightly, and began laughing as if in response to something quite funny. Calming down, I looked over to him again, and he looked up at the wall behind me very briefly, which made the still not so cognitive me find something hilarious on the wall, and began laughing too. At this point, I'm relatively sure I hallucinated a ceiling daisy-shaped screw thing on the wall. Just one, which I thought was the course of the humour. This trip wasn't like that of the previous trips, where the laughter felt plastic and fake, but it actually felt genuine, like my first real trip with this drug. After calming down, I, sitting up, and still on the trip, began to explain to my sitter the specifics of my trip. We conversed for a while, and my sitter eventually got up to leave the room, but first quickly flicked the lights in the room on and off. Experienced with salvia as he is, he knew what he was doing. And this provided my world an explosion of small, round kaleidoscopes of faces, in place of the after images of the room. To be honest, it was quite an interesting effect. Between my 2 trips, my sitter had a go with 20x. From my trip to after his trip and come down, we apparently experienced a bit of time dissociation, as we found we had gone an hour, and thought it had been a fair bit less of time. It's weird that we'd taken salvia at different times but still had the same time issue strike us. My blasting off into salvia space of 60x was awesome. I took a massive drag from the bong, and held it probably not as long as I should have, perhaps 15 to 25 seconds. While holding in the first drag, I set the lighter down on the nightstand next to the bed, knowing this stuff was going to strike fast. Exhaling, I took in what was left in the chamber, observing the bit of salvia still burning, a glow bright before extinguishing, and being replaced by fine white ash. I went to put the bong down on the nightstand. This is where the memory gap begins, filled by the sitter. I failed to have the bong reach the surface of the stand, instead dropping it to the floor in transit. I abruptly lay back and had a little blackout time. I sat up, and this is the end of the memory gap. As I understand it now, my consciousness fought to remain out of the trip. I pulled at the blankets beneath me and began sliding one leg off of the bed, when a break in the stormy mind of me brought a bit of cognitive stability, and I made the realization that I was unintentionally fighting the trip by keeping open my eyes. Closing my eyes, I began to have a small bit of hallucination. The problem that arose in this situation, though, and which I now realise has always been an issue with me and my trips, was that I didn't really trust my senses, in that I was questioning as to whether or not I was actually hallucinating, or, which doesn't seem logical due to my having known I had just taken a drug, either seeing after images of light from when my eyes were open, and I quickly shut my eyes, or experiencing a runaway imagination. After letting go of the question and forcefully mentally telling myself it was the drug and not my imagination, I drifted into seeing some quite interesting visuals, consisting of the normal kaleidoscope of open-mouthed faces of quite a large size. But the evolution of this trip was a panning out from these specific faces to include thousands of faces, revolving in place. And in general, they were being perceived as a giant plane that had the ability to change form as if like a piece of pin art, where each pin sits at a specific elevation to mimic almost any form pressed into it. Each kaleidoscopic image represented a pinhead, and as one, they all rippled and changed. In a significant part of the trip, the pin art lookalike plane of kaleidoscopic faces pushed upwards and created the image of a smiling female face. I marked this as a significant part of the trip. It was quite detailed and rather pleasant to see. In approximately the same instance, a wave rippled over the smiling face. The wave wasn't so much from a changing elevation of the pin art-like plane, but from the kaleidoscope of faces individually flipping in place, revealing a second side to them, devoid of colour, unlike the other sides of the small images which were yellow, tan, and brown. Unlike the refracted kaleidoscope facial images, this part of the trip had a more natural feel to it. I think it's odd to say in light of the grayscale imagery I experienced at that moment, but it had less of a mechanical feel about it. It was at this point I was about 50% cognitive and was voicing my opinions of the trip as it had so progressed to my sitter, attempting to convey the extreme intensity and power of the trip, and, of course, what I could do at that time and see, although I hadn't quite processed all the imagery myself at the time. By this time, I was firmly pressing my hands against my eyes, as one would press against the glass of a window for a better view. The mental scene changed imagery past this point into the trip to an overhead view of parallel pillars still composed of fractal faces. The overhead view was a moving one, going in between the pillars at a high distance, and made for quite an interesting effect. My trip sitter thought it prudent at this point to speak. He had obviously understood by now I was mostly cognitive, and I wasn't going to have a bad reaction to his voice. He asked me if he could say something. His voice altered my visuals in such a way as to produce one pillar in my vision moving independently of the others having themselves not been moving in the first place, and unlike the others, composed of a great many white daisies. Of course, I told him he could say something, an attempt on my part to recreate the variable that which had effect on my visuals, and he proceeded to do something to the extent of saying, "Hi Stephen," which I can't recall having done anything profound to the visuals at that point. The visuals eventually began to fade, and I gave up on holding my eyes shut, instead recapping to my sitter what had happened. Throughout the trip, there was no true audio hallucinations, more like a feeling of pressure on my ears with perhaps a steady deep background noise. In all, the main part of the trip lasted 15 minutes, which was an oddity by itself considering I often have trips as short as 3 minutes, to usually as long as maybe 6. The come down afterwards was a brief half an hour, and was a rather euphoric and happy time for me, definitely a result of the drug. All in all, it was an intensely powerful trip that, in recap, was one of the most pleasant I've actually been through. I learnt this trip through that my rating system of trips had been previously wrong, a scale of 1 through 6 as described on the internet, and that while most of this trip would have been considered a 3 on said scale, closed-eyed visuals, not so much so regarding open-eyed, it was more powerful than anything from before it. I learned, abiding by this system, only can hold myself back, and that when blasting off to salvia space, I should simply let go and close my eyes, not looking for total open-eyed immersion that I've experienced before. Additionally, I came to understand that my questioning whether the trip is actually a hallucination, or whether or not it was my imagination run wild, was an example of fighting my trip, and that it too only holds me back. I need to accept better, and not reject so readily. Overall, an awesome experience.